Hello YouTube and welcome to the second episode of Sega SG Awesome. This episode we're going to look at the first game for the Sega SG-1000, at least by catalog number. It's catalog number 1001, titled Borderline. This is actually a port of an arcade game that was released in 1980 under the same name. As a side note, in Germany this game got a science fiction type makeover and went by the name Star Raker. The first game being an arcade port seems very fitting. I always considered Sega to be an arcade manufacturer that dabbled in home consoles. This is kind of the complete opposite of Nintendo, which is a home console manufacturer that kind of dabbled in arcades. So to begin, we're actually going to look at a little bit of Sega's arcade history. This is going to be needed for this episode and a lot of the future ones. Sega's been making arcade games since, well, really before video games. They were originally founded in Hawaii and made electromechanical novelty games. These are still arcade games and still feature a lot of the same gameplay. The difference is they were all made with actual mechanical items instead of just graphics. A lot of these early games were in the racing or shooting genre. These games have an unbelievable amount of charm to them. And I'm not just saying that as in a kind of historical, it's nice to see the way things used to be. They actually do some things better. It's like watching an old movie pre-CGI. There's just a way that the mechanical effects can bring in a new level of realism. Ultimately, when you're watching CGI, it always looks artificial no matter how good you think it gets. Consider Sega's last electromechanical game called Killer Shark. It actually featured a projector that would create the image on the screen, a very proto-FMV quality, but was creepy enough to provide a chilling effect in the movie Jaws. Look at the animation and think about how long it took for us to get to that level of animation again. But Sega did move on to what we would call a video game. Most of these games, at least in the early days, were just copies off of other games. They started off with Pong clones, Space Invader clones, and just anything that was popular, Sega had their own version of it. Sega dabbled in these kind of copies off of other games and in the black and white genre for most of the 70s. But in the late 70s to early 80s, that's when they moved to original games and moved to games that were in color. This era produced a lot of very high quality games such as Turbo, which really set the technological standard for Sega. It introduced the sprite scaling technology. This was way ahead of the technology and carried Sega through Space Harrier and Afterburner. On an interesting side note, you can actually track a lot of Sega's history just through their racing games. That's probably Sega's biggest series in my opinion. Turbo set the standard for all of their games after that up until their three-dimensional polygonal standard, which was actually set by Virtua Racing. The Pit Crew and Virtua Racing were actually the test models for Virtua Fighter. It was during the late 70s, early 80s that Sega decided to try some budget titles called the Vic Duel. This allowed two smaller games to be in one cabinet. These games are nowhere near the arcade quality that Turbo had. They were more along the lines of an Atari home console game. But they did offer two games in one. This was great for places that didn't have a lot of space but still wanted to offer a lot of games. And it just, offered the very fantastic sales strategy of, hey, you get to double your money, which is what Sega attempted to do. Now, whether this actually happened, I don't know. People are going to be more familiar with the Vic Duel games than they actually originally think. Probably the most famous one is Deep Scan. This was used during the loading levels of the Sega Saturn game Dynamite Decca, or in other regions, Die Hard Arcade. But these Vic Duel games marked the very first SG-1000 games, and the SG-1000 actually produced them very, very well. Here's a footage of the arcade version of Borderline. The dead giveaway that this is the arcade game is the resolution and the aspect ratio. Notice how tall it is. Now here's a version on the SG-1000. Graphically, they're actually very similar and quite impressive. The aspect ratio is really the dead giveaway that's a home console version. One very interesting aspect is the music on the home version. Arcade games at this time really didn't have music. Music in arcade games really started around 1980. Now, the first Sega game to have music was actually Hang On. This is according to an interview by Yu Suzuki. And that came out in 1985, so it's quite possible that Borderline, the home console version, with its added music, is the first Sega game to have a soundtrack. Another interesting thing to note about Borderline is that the porting credits seem to go to Masamitsu Nitani. Now, this is hard to track down since these early games really didn't have a credit screen or anything, but Masamitsu Nitani is known as being the founder of the company Compile. Compile was known for the Puyo Puyo series, and actually in the early days acted as kind of a second party to Sega, making several of their games. They were one of the only other companies besides Sega actually making the games during the time that Nintendo had their if you make games for the NES or Famicom, you can't make games for anyone else policy. As influential as Compile will become for Sega, it's nice to see them involved in the very first game. Now we know it's Masamitsu Nitani because if you dump the ROM, you see the compiling credits as Mu, which was a nickname he used. So let's go ahead and look at the game proper. In Borderline, you take control of a heavily armed off-road vehicle. Your goal is simple: make it through the waves of enemies and their defenses, and take out the energy plants. These are symbolized by the atom sign. So originally playing it, I kind of assumed you were taking out atomic bombs, but according to the arcade manual, you seem to be taking out their energy-producing facilities. Along the way, these weird triangular things come after you. These are supposedly rockets. You can go through and collect fuel containers along the way. This helps your score at the end. Now, one of the strategies I have in this is to stick close to the wall while you're going through the small corridors. You rarely get hit. In fact, it's so rare, for the first hour or so playing it, I thought you couldn't get hit, and it was just kind of this glitch that you could exploit in the system. And where the first board almost plays as a vertical shooter, the second board almost plays like combat. You go around taking out the enemy tanks, and you try to destroy the energy-producing equipment at the end of each one. This is how the remaining boards actually play as well. So even though the change in gameplay from the first board to the second board is great, you don't see a lot of change in gameplay on the third or fourth board. This I found kind of disappointing, as the first board actually turns out to be the funnest. Now, this isn't a horrible thing. This is actually quite common for games at that time. Fantastic games like Kaboom were just the same thing over and over. So as long as what it does is good, it's not bad that it repeats. In this game, what it does is mainly good. And then you get to the fourth and final board of the game. It's really just a small variation of what came before it, but this time there's only one energy reserve to take down, but it's guarded by a gun turret. It's a lot more difficult at first, but once you really kind of figure it out, it's not too bad. The main trick is to actually get into the walled-in area where the energy plant is. After that, it's a piece of cake. At this point, that's when the game just cycles over. It's one of those classic games where once you beat so many boards, it just goes right back to the beginning. It's not trying to beat the game, it's trying to get the best score possible. The bottom line is, as I was playing Borderline, I quite enjoyed it. I mean, it's just a standard old high score game. There's no end to it, it's just going through and trying to beat your best high score. One of those games where you sat down next to the console with your game, you just play it for 10 minutes, see if you beat the high score that was written in the instruction booklet. If you did, fantastic, that's a good day. If you didn't, you swap it out and play another game. In Borderline, it succeeds at this. It's honestly pretty fun. While I was reviewing this, I found myself, once I was getting home from work, wanting to actually play Borderline. I went a lot further into the research than I really needed to on it. And I got a lot of stuff that hasn't even made it in here because I'm still kind of attempting to figure it out. So this game actually is fun. Honestly, once I'm done with this video, I probably will go back and play this game a little bit more. And it does get challenging. I haven't been able to make it past the third round in it. Now, the amount of time that I've played it hasn't necessarily been a whole lot, but still, that's a pretty decent challenge. If you have an SG-1000, it would be a shame to pass this game up. It is actually surprisingly fun. Now, I wouldn't make it one of the first games that you'd pick up. It's no Girls Garden or Starjacker. But it does that old classic arcade game very well. It's also awesome just because it's the first Sega home console game. And if you're like most of us and grew up in a place that did not have the SG-1000, you probably thought that Sega kind of missed this whole era of video game systems. Like collecting Sega, I always thought I was missing out on games from the early 80s and late 70s, the very dawn of video games. So it always seemed like, you know what, I should pick up an Atari 2600. But it turns out Sega was actually fairly active during this time. The SG-1000 brought out a lot of games that are fairly representative of that era of gaming, so you can actually own Sega consoles that really cover the beginning of games. This really feels like an Atari 5200 or 7800 game.